Mr. President, later today or tomorrow, we're going to be dealing with a $1 trillion omnibus bill, and I want to explain why I will be strongly voting against that bill. But before I do, I think it's important to put the budget in a broader context of what's happening in America, because you can't look at a budget in the abstract. You have to see it within a context. And the context is that right now, as I think most Americans understand, the middle class of this country is disappearing. Median family income has gone down by $5,000 since 1999. You have male workers today. The median male worker is making $700 less in inflation-adjusted dollars than he made 41 years ago. The median female worker is making $1,300 less than she made 7 years ago. Meanwhile, while the middle class disappears and we have more people living in poverty than at almost any time in modern American history, the gap between the very, very rich and everybody else is growing wider. We have massive wealth inequality in America. One family, the Walton family, owns more wealth than the bottom 40% of the American people. Top 0.1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90% of the American people. And today, unbelievably, 95% of all new income is going to the top 1%, and corporate profits are at an all-time high. That is the overall reality of what's going on with the American economy today. And in the midst of that, we have a budget. So let's talk a little bit about this $1 trillion budget and how it addresses or doesn't address the problems facing our country. Are there good things in this budget? And their answer is absolutely. I'm chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, and I want to thank Chairman Mikulski and others for making sure that our VA gets the kind of budget that they need. Included in that budget, by the way, is also a provision called advanced appropriations for the VA, which will mean that in the event of a government shutdown, veterans will still be able to get the disability benefits that they desperately need. And there are other provisions in there that are very, very good. But overall, if you look at the budget in the context of contemporary American society, this is simply not a good budget. And let me just pick up 3 points where I have strong disagreements. Mr. President, I think the vast majority of the American people understand that we have huge unmet needs in this country. I expect your state of Virginia, certainly in Vermont and all over this country, we all know that our infrastructure is crumbling, our roads, bridges, water systems, wastewater plants, our rail system is falling behind Europe, Japan, even China. We have enormous work to be done. The American Society of Civil Engineers tells us we have to invest $3 trillion into rebuilding our infrastructure. In terms of college, we know that there are hundreds of thousands of bright young people who can't afford to go to college. Others are graduating school saddled forever with these terrible debts from college or graduate school. This budget doesn't address those problems, doesn't address the crisis of childcare, and the fact that in Vermont and around the country, very hard for working-class families to get quality, affordable childcare. But what this budget does do, people don't know it, 60%, roughly 60% of the budget goes to defense spending. 60% of the discretionary budget goes not to our kids, not to our elderly, not to students, not to working people, not to infrastructure, not to all of the huge unmet needs we face as a country, goes to the military. Does anyone here deny that we need a strong military, strong National Guard? I don't. We do. But sometimes, in tough times, you got to make decisions. And I think spending $554 billion on the military is just too much. And I would point out, Mr. President, what I'm sure you know, is that it is clear, it has been admitted, that the military can't even audit itself. We don't even know effectively and appropriately how the military is spending its money. They don't even have the computer technology to tell us where they are spending. What we also know is that cost overruns in the military are extraordinary. Time after time after time, an agreement is reached about how much a weapon system would cost, and it turns out that the contractor was just joking because there's a huge overrun. And then you got fraud. Virtually every major military contractor has been involved in fraud, either resulting in either convictions or settlements with the government. So we have folks here who last year were talking about cuts in nutrition programs, education, healthcare, you name it, programs that are life and death for working families, yet when it comes to the military, we can spend $554 billion. I think that's too much. Second of all, when you look at the global economy and you look at our international partners, I find it interesting that every other major country on earth provides health care for all of their people as a right, except the United States. And yet, in terms of their defense spending, they're spending a heck of a lot less than we are. We are spending now almost as much as the entire rest of the world combined. So I object in this bill to the significant amount of money being spent on the military, and I would have hoped that there would be more opposition to this large military expenditure. Second point that I want to make, Mr. President, and it has not gotten a whole lot of attention, and that is the impact that this legislation will have on working people in terms of cuts in pensions. There are provisions in this bill, written in secret, which allow significant cuts in benefits for retirees who are members of multi-employer pension plans. As mentioned in the Washington Post in a recent article, quote, the language in this bill, would alter 40 years of federal law and could affect millions of workers, many of them part of a shrinking core of middle-income employees in businesses such as trucking, construction, and supermarkets, end of quote. Reuters mentions, and I quote, the centerpiece is a provision that would open the door to cutting current beneficiaries' benefits, a retirement policy taboo, and a potential disaster for retirees on fixed incomes, end of quote. What does that mean? When you go to work for a company, you get wages, you get benefits, but you also, in some cases, get a promise in terms of a pension. What you will get when you retire after 20 years, 30 years, 40 years of work. What this bill does is allow companies to renege on that promise. And my understanding that in some cases, the cuts in pensions could be draconian, talking about a 50% cut. So can you imagine somebody who has worked his or her entire life, expects to retire with a certain level of income, and suddenly, after 20, 30, 40 years of work, suddenly wakes up in the morning and finds out that that promise has been cut in half. Wow, that is awful. That is totally awful. And I remember back, as the American people do, that when Wall Street, the CEOs of Wall Street, engaged in illegal and reckless behavior, which drove this economy into the worst recession in modern history, impacting millions and millions of people's lives, what happened to Wall Street? Well, Congress bailed them out. Congress bailed out the folks on Wall Street whose criminal action cost the recession. And now you have working people who have done nothing wrong except work their entire lives, 10, 20, 30 years, and through no fault of their own, they're not getting bailed out. They're going to see a 50% reduction in their pensions. That is unacceptable. And that opens it just opens up a future in terms of pensions, which I think are very frightening for the American people. So I can't support that provision as well. Last point that I want to make is getting back to Wall Street. In my very strong opinion, we have reached the stage with Wall Street that the major financial institutions are just too big, They are just too powerful. And anyone who thinks that Congress regulates Wall Street has got it backwards. Because the reality is that Wall Street, with their incredible wealth and lobbying capabilities and campaign contributions, Wall Street regulates the United States Congress. And you cannot see a better example of it than what is in this legislation. Recent article, New York Times. Banks lobbyists, in this provision, banks lobbyists help in drafting financial bills. And Mr. President, without objection, I would like to enter this article into the record.
Without objection.
Quote, in a sign of Wall Street's resurgent influence in Washington, Citigroup's recommendations were reflected in more than 70 lines of the House Committee's 85-line bill. Two crucial paragraphs prepared by Citigroup in conjunction with other Wall Street banks were copied nearly word for word. In other words, it's not even members of Congress writing these bills. It is Wall Street writing the bills and getting them into this legislation. Now, what does this legislation do? We suffered the worst economic crisis since the 1930s because of the greed, recklessness, and illegal behavior on Wall Street. What Wall Street did is engage in absolutely reckless speculation. Then the chickens came home to roost. People could not pay back the debts that they incurred on subprime mortgages. And the entire financial system of the United States of America and the world was on the verge of collapse. So Congress, a few years ago, passed Dodd-Frank. Didn't go anywhere near as far as I would go. I believe we should break up these major financial institutions. I don't believe you can control them. I don't believe you can regulate them. They regulate the Congress. But Dodd-Frank took some steps forward. And there was one provision, and I will quote, Section 716. And, Mr. President, I would ask unanimous right to put this into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And this is what it says, 716. This is the title of the provision that this bill repeals. Quote, prohibition against federal government bailouts of swap entities. A, prohibition on federal assistance. Notwithstanding any other provision of law, including regulations, no federal assistance may be provided to any swaps entity with respect to any swap, security-based swap, or other activity of the swaps entity, end of quote. That is what is being repealed. So Wall Street, as a result of the work of Citigroup and the other Wall Street companies, can now continue to engage in reckless derivative speculation, and when they make a whole lot of money, they get richer. But when they lose money because of the repeal of this provision, it is the taxpayers of this country who have to bail them out. Does anybody think that that makes any sense at all? That's in this bill. So, Mr. President, for those reasons and more, I would hope very much that the Senate rejects this agreement, that we renegotiate. No one wants to see the government shut down, but that we negotiate an agreement that is much fairer to the American people and to the working families of our country. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.